Thank you to the ranking member. Your time has expired. My pleasure now to yield to the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Nadler, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Sicharan, how has the legacy of the 9/11 attack continued to impact South Asian communities in New York?
Thank you, Representative Nadler, for that question, and I want to thank you for your leadership. What I have witnessed over the pandemic is that the already weak and disenfranchised circumstances in which our community members found themselves, that is directly tied to the lack of investment in our communities after 9/11, made them that much more vulnerable to the pandemic. They were members of our community, such as in Southeast Queens, that experienced the highest infection rates, yet it was impossible to get appropriate help and attention during the pandemic. And in the rebuilding and recovery process, say of our small businesses, while our small businesses are trying to rebuild, they still struggle with discrimination and cultural isolation, language barriers, et cetera.
Thank you. Ms. Akri, your testimony noted that Sikhs continue to face difficulty in accessing workplaces in a range of sectors and industries. What kinds of barriers do religious minorities face in workplaces where Title VII fails to protect their civil rights and civil liberties?
Thank you, Congressman. As you know, under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, employers are prohibited from discriminating against employees on the basis of religion. The biggest issue is that the threshold under Title VII for employers to deny the provision of a religious accommodation is extremely low. All they have to do is show that there's a de minimis cost, often interpreted as any cost, associated with providing the request, and then they can successfully overcome that Title VII standard. It's really the lowest legal standard for any civil rights provision and leaves religious minorities out on an island of isolation, segregation, and failure to hire. And I believe that that is one of the largest issues that comes to the floor when we're talking about workplace discrimination against Sikhs and other religious minorities.
What standard would you suggest?
Well, under the ADA, for example, there's a higher threshold, which is the undue hardship standard. It's much more difficult for employers to overcome that burden. The balancing test is much more in favor of employees that are seeking an accommodation. I believe that that is the standard that would be more appropriate for religious accommodations as well.
Thank you. Professor Wadia, I wanted to ask you to elaborate on some of your testimony, even though Ms. Ross asked Ms. Barry about the same thing. Your testimony describes how in the years following 9/11, the federal government developed several new immigration policies in the name of national security. Can you describe how these policies impacted Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities?
Thank you for the question. And really the history predates 9/11. But in the 9/11 context, I spoke in my oral testimony about the special registration program, and the immigration consequences included, for example, someone receiving a charging document and being placed in deportation proceedings, an individual because of an overstay being deported, an individual because of a failure to register, because maybe they did not even know about the special registration program, being denied an immigration benefit or a green card years later while sitting in an immigration office during an adjustment interview. We saw other 9/11 policies that were in the name of national security, but in fact, immigration changes. And so some of those consequences included, for example, the detention of 1,200 men who were broadly labeled as September 11th detainees, coming largely from Masa communities. We also saw an absconder initiative where individuals who had orders of removal were identified, targeted, and punished by the federal government. So these are some of the examples, if you connect the dots, in which national security was used as a proxy for immigration policy and then led to serious immigration consequences. What we didn't see is a great gain in finding the next terrorist. And so what the fallout and collateral damage was in the immigration space.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.